Welcome to Ufahamu Africa, a podcast on life and politics on the continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, Kim, and hello, listeners. So this week we have, I think, a really excellent episode that continues our conversation we started last week from the African Studies Association panel meeting that Kim and I participated in on democratic backsliding and identifying sources and sites of possible resistance to such autocratization from elected executives, that is usually presidents. So last week in episode 186, Kim and I charted out the territory with a conversation about potential actors and institutions and how such contestations played out to maintain democracy in Malawi, thanks to Kim and Boniface Dulani. And this week, you're going to hear from Alexandra Blackman, an assistant professor of government at Cornell University, on the case of Tunisia and the particular trajectory of an executive override of all countervailing institutions, like just shutting down the legislature. So we learned a lot from Alex's research during the ASA meeting, and we hope you will too. She's a specialist of Tunisia, and her current book manuscript examines the role of French colonization in the formation of Tunisian political identities and in the development of the Tunisian state's relationship to religious institutions. Her research also includes issues of gender, political party development, the evolution of authoritarian institutions, and the role of foreign and transnational forces in the region. Now, in our news wrap, Kim provides a roundup of the Democratic Republic of Congo's elections this week, and I share a little bit of intrigue on a question of art repatriation. I also just wanted to point our listeners to a quick scholarship alert. The Open Society University Network has a forum on democracy and development that's hosted by CEU, the Central European University, in Budapest, and has partners in Bogota and Cape Town and Colombo, and so in Sri Lanka. So we just wanted to let people know we'll share this link in our show notes, but there are a total of 32 open positions, including 6 postdoctoral fellowships and 2 senior research fellows at each of these 4 institutions for next academic year. So take a look on these questions of democracy and development, very apropos of our conversation today, and put in an application if they fit for you.
Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. I hadn't heard about it. It sounds like a really exciting opportunity, to be in one of many number of great places in the world to study and to teach about and to learn about democracy and development. So there has been a lot written about the elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So those began on Wednesday, December 20th. They were extended an additional day because there were some challenges in the voting, shall we say? To quote our dear friend and colleague, Laura C., also known as Texas in Africa, it was a mess. And so they had to extend voting a second day. And we'll put some links in our show notes to reporting about this, in particular, some of the challenges that arose on the first day and the reasons why they had to extend it a second day. To get everyone up to speed, these general elections, I think the focal point for everyone is the presidential race. So incumbent President Felix Tshisekedi is seeking his second 5-year term as president. And, he's been spending much of his time in office trying to gain legitimacy after what, was a highly disputed 2018 election. Now, for those who don't know, the rules in the Congo are plurality rules. So Tshisekedi does not have to win a majority of support in this crowded field of candidates running for the presidency. He just has to win the most votes. So in 2018, he won with less than half the votes. He won with about 38% of the vote share, the presidential vote share. And with so many candidates running, again, he doesn't need a majority. There is no 2-round system in the Congo. And that may explain why we see a crowded field of opposition candidates and not seeing kind of this pre-electoral, coalition or even, potential for bargaining between opposition candidates or opposition parties. It might also help to explain why we're seeing so many electoral irregularities, right? So There was something, Sonia Raleigh, who's a journalist who follows the Congo closely and often reports from the Congo, had posted a link to a Congolese source of just kind of outlining the many incidents about irregularities in these elections. And, for example, having polling stations in military schools, in the headquarters of political parties, right? These are all prohibited by electoral law, like where you put polling stations where people vote. It's supposed to be independent, nonpartisan. Clearly that's not the case. But also there's a great article, I think from earlier this week that was published in the New York Times. It gives a good overview of the elections and all that's at stake. It goes a little long on Patrice Lumumba, who, is this kind of heroic anti-colonial figure from 60 years ago. So I'm not quite sure why we need to go long on Lumumba. I mean, sure, like he's very important in Congolese history. And, I think as an American, it's probably like the Congolese person I know the most about. I think, we have a bit of a fascination with him, but otherwise I think that New York Times piece by Declan Walsh is a good primer on the elections and to kind of understand a lot of what's at stake. But I'd also recommend that our listeners read a piece, an essay in The Nation that was also published this week by Hugh Kinsella Cunningham and Nicholas Niarchos, which talks about the elections, but also talks more generally about the difficult context in which these elections are being held, and how, the Civil War, and really, the multi-actor war that's been happening in predominantly in Eastern Congo, just makes it a very difficult place to hold elections. And this is, of course, reminding me of Severin Atasser's work about, kind of these international norms and expectations that if we can just hurry up and run an election, like then democracy happens. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of elections, but I think, reading Severin's work about international interventions in DRC, we should all pause and think about what does it mean when we are rushed to hold elections and we're not paying attention to the context and people's need for security and also for the development of norms and support for these elections. So I think reading this piece by Kinsella Cunningham and Niarchos can provide a bit broader context in which the elections are being held, and also some of the things that don't quite get as much attention in the New York Times piece we're going to link to by Declan Walsh. For example, the harassment of the press. It's really hard to have a true election if the press can't freely report. And it's hard to know if the election is going to be done in a way that's, I don't know what the buzzwords are that we read in election monitoring reports these days, because it's never about free and fair anymore, because everyone knows it's not free and it's definitely not fair. But if it's like accountable or transparent, I can't remember the adjectives we use now because we know that we can't use free and fair. But the extent to which we can have that given the context, but also, there have been street protests in, not just in Eastern Congo, but, across this very large country in Central Africa. And, I don't want to diminish the importance of elections. I just want to remind us that democracy is practiced in lots of ways. It's not just waiting in a queue to put a piece of paper in a box, right? Democracy can also be practiced, as many Congolese have shown us over these years, that democracy can be practiced by taking to the streets and demanding things, not just of your government, but of these international interveners who have, decided to put some tent stakes in your country, right? Like, trying to use your voice to make demands of the people who seem to have control. Though I will say, if I want to be optimistic about what's happening here, um, you know, I think Tshisekedi's going to win. He's the one who's so that doesn't, I'm not optimistic in that sense. Like, I think the incumbent has a lot of advantage in counting the votes. But if there's anything we learn from Jamie Black and Nick Vandewall's book, is that sometimes elections can make a transition possible. And right, they start with the famous example in their book of Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia and how he miscalculated. He thought he would win, held an election, turns out he lost. And, it took a little bit of time for him to actually exit office, but elections are a focal point. They allow the citizens of the country to really kind of focus their attention. And even with all of these irregularities and challenges, kudos to the Congolese people for nonetheless standing in line, for hours on end in the dark, waiting, demanding that they have the opportunity to cast their ballot, to participate in this process, even if the process overall is flawed, even if, the game is fixed, they're still showing up and they're still showing that, they're Democrats, they're participating in democracy.
Mm-hmm. Kim, it's such a good point. And especially, we talk a lot in this panel and last week about when and where the opposition has an ability to coalesce. And here, there are many reasons why it's difficult for the opposition to coalesce in every context, and especially in this current context, particularly where there are these histories of conflict and current conflict. And so just the very vibrancy of opposition, right? The fact that there are a lot of contestations in this election, I think really speaks to your point and does give people a sense of choice and participation. So we'll keep our listeners posted on how this rolls out. And Kim, before we go to our episode for this week, I wanted to share one headline with you that jumped out at me recently. It's been circulating in the news for a little while, but this is one version of the headline from Business Insider. It says, a couple sold an African mask they thought was worthless for $158. The buyer, an art dealer, then auctioned it off for $4.4 million. I think that's
oh my God.
Right? So I was like, tell me more about this mask and what's going on. So looking into this story, an elderly French couple were cleaning out the second home attic and came across this mask that they brought to a secondhand dealer, and they settled on an offer of 150 euros. Apparently neither the dealer nor the couple were aware of the mask's market value at that time. And then a few months later, the couple found out that it had been auctioned for this astronomical sum, 4.2 million euros. And so then the couple, the Fourniers, launched a court case to try to annul the auction and to have that sum come to them as the original owners of the piece. Well, so there's questions about authenticity of the mask and the like. Well, one of the couple's grandfather had been a colonial governor in Central Africa.
Yikes.
Right?
Yikes. Oh,
So
everyone sucks here. Yeah, okay, but keep going. Sorry.
Right?
Oh.
No, exactly. So the plot thickens, right? So clearly, like, we're not sure about how the mask was acquired. But we know that it's authentic in terms of where it's coming from. The art dealer takes it to have it fully appraised and carbon dated, etc. And then in doing so finds out that it's this incredibly valuable and rare piece. Now, you might be thinking, in all of this incredibly rare and valuable piece, to whom does it originally belong? Well, as these headlines start to make waves, the Gabonese government weighs in and requests the suspension of such proceedings and says, just give us our mask back. right? Gabon has now filed a separate court case accusing the Fournier's ancestor of having stolen this very valuable mask and therefore never kind of being its rightful owner. And so what they're asking is just to annul the auction as well, and that the mask be returned to its country of origin. So apparently the mask is an extremely rare artifact of great spiritual value, of course, making what makes it so valuable as a piece of art. But for the Gabonese people, it's a ritual object used to ensure peace in society, and it's incredibly important. And it was used to administer justice within the Fang communities of Gabon. So this is an interesting thing. We don't know how the legal battle will be settled, but one of the
But our listeners know what we feel about this. Like it's not a secret. Give it back.
There's no secret.
It's not yours.
Exactly.
And like also this explains a lot. Okay, so Gabon was ruled by a family of dictators for all these years because the French stole this really important spiritual object. So just give it back. And you know what? We just had a coup in Gabon. Like, give it back. And like, who knows what kind of peace and prosperity is going to happen? Like, that has been missing. It's like, give it back. And also, like, can you pay tax on like back taxes on like having held this? There's some reparations. Like, just give it back. Okay. But also, I'm super curious to know, like, who bought it? Like, who wanted, so it's like, there's all these questions, like, because I'm so glad that you found out the provenance of the mask, because I was going to say, well, where is it from? Because of course, I'm sure the headline was like African mask. It's like, it's a big continent. Like, tell us where it's from. And even within Gabon, right? Like, so we know that it's from the Fang community. So, who even wants it? Like, I mean, I'm glad, of course, it's probably, expensive. One might even say priceless, right? But there's something really kind of like, there's so many elements to this story that are just like deeply troubling, right? Like the great-great-grandfather colonizer, right?
Exactly.
The fact that they found it in the attic of their second home, like, congratulations.
Yes. And then when you find out it's worth 4 million, then you think, oh, maybe we should have had some of that.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't be, putting the price tag of 4 million on it, and we can give it back to its rightful owners.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, maybe pay them some back pay for having held on to this very valuable, one would say priceless, but also $4.2 million is, like, let's think of over the decades that it has, not been with its rightful owner.
Exactly. And it's so interesting because, as we know, France under like President Macron has been involved in these questions about restitution, and he's called for the return. He had this high profile commission and called for the return of colonial artifacts from French collections to their original owners, because this wasn't in a public setting. Of course, it was never part of that archiving, and not.
But we don't know that it was not part of the public setting. Like, sure, it was in someone's attic, but how do we not know that the colonizing great-great-grandpa didn't take it from what was a public setting, right? Because they were an official on behalf of the French colonial government. So anything they acquired, right? Like, if we just think of like today, if there was someone from the French Foreign Ministry in a country that received a gift, like that is not a personal gift, right? That is that's something that's part of like public. So that's the whole, like, if we just apply that logic. Yeah. It's also really like important. I think I just want to remind, like, this was an object not just of spiritual importance, but also related to justice.
Exactly.
Come on, like, where's the justice? Like, let's, again, I don't know. I guess we have strong opinions, listeners. And, if you disagree with us, that's fine. Everyone's allowed to have opinions. Ours is right. So
exactly. And so Kim would appreciate this headline and the intrigue here, since we've had some really amazing guests on talking about art and restitution. And so this is, yet another example where it seems pretty clear what to do with the mask.
Yeah, I can't wait to look for pictures of it online. I'm really excited to see what it looks like, and also to learn more about what this object means, and what it would mean for it to be returned to its rightful owners.
Absolutely. So we'll share links to those stories as well in our show notes. And now for our listeners, take a listen to Alex Blackman talk about Tunisia and democratic backsliding.
All right. Yes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tunisia and change the tone a little bit of what's been said so far. So Rachel highlighted some reasons for optimism or lessons that can be taken from the African continent. And Kim just talked about a case of resilience. Tunisia is a place where the democratic backsliding has been very rapid and very extreme, and I'm going to end without much hope at the end. So just to give a timeline, also this is the data from VDEM. I think it will be no new information here. Sorry, the text is kind of small, but no new information here that Tunisia had a revolution in 2010, 2011 that ushered in a decade of democratic governance in the country. So this was a period of what I characterize as a very successful democratic transition and a very limited and ultimately unsuccessful period of democratic consolidation. So the political elite were able to come together and compromise over a new constitution, over new electoral rules. They successfully held ultimately 3 free and fair elections in the country in 2011, 2014, and 2019. And they also alternated power. So it wasn't that the same political parties or the same presidential candidates were winning these elections and not giving up power, but they were actually alternating power fairly successfully. However, there was growing popular frustration with the political elite at this time. So observers of Tunisia were very concerned about one type of polarization, which was polarization between Islamist and secular groups. And that type of polarization is certainly important to pay attention to in much of North Africa and the Arab world. But there was another type of polarization that was receiving a lot less academic attention, and that was the polarization between citizens and the political elite. So there were the beginnings of populist movements that we saw emerging already in the middle of this decade of democratic governance that ultimately became very important. It sort of were the seeds of democratic backsliding, if you will, in 2021. So what happens in 2021? Well, in July of 2021, the current president and then President Kais Saied invoked an article of the Constitution that he argued gave him expansive executive power. There were disagreements over the interpretation of this emergency clause, but unlike the Malawi case where the courts are powerful and empowered to make decisions to rule against a sitting president, the Tunisian elite had never agreed about how to actually constitute their constitutional court. So their new constitution had outlined this constitutional court body that was going to have the power to adjudicate disputes between the prime minister, the parliament, and the president. But the political parties could not agree about who to seat to that court. So when a constitutional crisis emerged, there was actually no judicial body that was capable and empowered to make any type of ruling on the situation. Kais Saied, the parliamentarians show up at the doors of the parliament, and Kais Saied and the military lock the doors to the parliament. They are unable to be in the parliament and work. He doesn't disband the parliament at this time, he simply suspends it. But since then, he's rewritten the Constitution. He's held a constitutional referendum on the Constitution that essentially he wrote nearly by himself, some indications suggest, and also wrote new electoral laws and held new parliamentary elections as of last December. So just to talk about what the sort of proximate factors are that contribute to Kais Said's power grab, people are going to point to a few key moments. So what's happening in July of 2021? Well, Tunisia is emerging from a extremely devastating fourth wave of the COVID epidemic, and also a period where they had major failures in their effort to vaccinate people within the country. And there was a lot of what was perceived as ineffectual governance, but also favoritism by the governance and who had access to healthcare at the time. And then, as I mentioned, there's also this inability to actually confirm judges to the Constitutional Court. So there's just no body that can actually adjudicate this dispute. So those are really the proximate causes that are happening in July and August of 2021. But when we take a step back and think about what are the more long-run factors that are contributing to this crisis, there are three major things that emerge. The first is a continued economic crisis. And this is something that we've known for a long time. I mean, we can think about Fred Schaefer's work on understandings of democracy in Senegal from the 90s, which is just that there are people have very different understandings of democracy. And one of the things that people emphasized during the democratic transition in Tunisia was that the democratic transition had to come with economic reform, had to equalize access, sort of equal opportunity for people in the country. That was a core complaint and a core motivation for the initial revolution in 2010, 2011. That crisis is never fully addressed. The political elite are doing a lot of stuff to improve procedural democracy. They are not doing a lot to improve economic equality or even access to opportunities in the country during this decade. And they are even putting off important reforms that they could have done in order to achieve those goals. So this is a really important issue, and there's just very little reform in that decade. And I have some research here on the left side that's a survey we did of election candidates at the local level. So these are people who should be very close to citizens. This is from the local election in 2018. We surveyed 2,000 candidates. And what you see is that even candidates that fail, even those who are not elected, are extremely unrepresentative of the underlying population. The underlying population is far poorer and far less educated than even these sort of mid-level political candidates. And so the divide between the political class, if you will, and citizens is very evident in the Tunisian case. There's also deadlock in parliament around these key issues. So the reason that there aren't economic reforms is because the parties are having trouble doing hard things. They agree to continue to work together to solve problems. They compromise really well over this overarching idea of cooperation and trying to sort of move the process forward. But that process isn't actually producing results at the level that the citizens need. And then finally, there's this emerging crisis of faith in the political elite and the rise of populism. So already by 2019, we see that even the secular faction and even the Islamist faction have splintered along these populist, non-populist lines. So we have the emergence in 2019 of a populist Islamist party that counters Ennahda, which is the mainstream Islamist party in Tunisia. And on the secular side, we have the emergence of a populist secular party, which is the sort of reemergence of a Ben Ali era party to counter the sort of mainstream secular party. So this populism is becoming very strong already by 2019. So what are the key actors then that tried to play a role in resisting this backsliding, tried to confront Kais Said as he's engaging in this power grab? Well, obviously, the former parliamentarians play a very important role. So as I've already said, they go to the parliament, they physically try to open the doors, they hold meetings, they hold press conferences. Despite the polarization that I've alluded to between Islamist and secular parties, there is some cooperation. It's not great cooperation during this crisis because they're pointing fingers at each other about why the crisis happened, but they do ultimately try to come together and condemn or criticize what Kais Said has done. They all realize that they are all being excluded from power through this constitutional crisis. So they do try to mobilize a sort of joint efforts to criticize him. These are completely ignored by the Kais Saied regime. He is just unfazed by this criticism. I've already said the judiciary was weak in Tunisia at this moment. So there were efforts. There was no constitutional court, but there was this Supreme Judicial Council, which is meant to help govern the judiciary in Tunisia and was viewed as having the objective of preserving the independence of the judiciary in the country. This is dissolved by Kais Saied fairly early on in the process. He fires judges illegally. He is criticized by human rights organizations, by judicial watch organizations. He's criticized by judges themselves. They hold protests. These are people who are fairly powerful within the Tunisian political space. And there is a ruling by other judges that he is obligated to reinstate the judges he's fired. He ignores all of these things, like, again, unfazed by this criticism. And then, of course, civil society, they are doing a lot of naming and shaming. They are reaching out to international partners. There are a lot of statements being put out by civil society organizations, cooperation. These also are ignored by the Saied regime. His strategy is simply to ignore these statements and to proceed, and he is largely successful. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is. I know I'm going to run out of time, but so this is just an example of the crisis of faith in politicians. Again, this is from some survey research we did, and it's impossible to see, but basically we ask people about their view of the parliament. Do they care about the average person? Do they use their power legitimately? And the overall view is that the parliament doesn't care about the average citizen, and they are not legitimate in their power. They don't care about the welfare of the people. So again, there's this major crisis of faith that makes those MPs very ineffectual in their criticism. Finally, other actors that actually support Saied or are sort of maybe like these weaker players. So again, we have really strong history of the role of unions in Tunisia. So they won the Nobel Peace Prize after the transition for helping to negotiate this compromise between the political parties that let the democratic transition proceed in 2014. So the UGTT is a very powerful union. They ultimately are very ambivalent initially about Kais Saied's power grab, in part because they recognize that the economic conditions in the country have not been addressed by the ruling elite, and their members, they have widespread membership, and their members are very ambivalent about the political elite themselves. So they are very, very cautious about taking sides in this. More recently, they've been more critical of Kais Saied, but it's a little bit too little too late. Popular attitudes, again, very ambivalent. So a little bit different than the Malawi story. There are massive protests against the Kais Saied power grab, but there are also counter protests. People are very divided over who they want to be in government, in part because they are so disillusioned with the rulers of the country. The military was largely viewed as captured by the regime. I still haven't seen a good explanation for that, because people had really celebrated the military for being very neutral whenever Ben Ali was removed from power. Somehow over the process of the decade of the transition, they become increasingly politicized, and they see some benefit to increasing autocratization. But I think we still have to figure out why that is. And then the election commission obviously is also captured by Kais Saied. He uses this as a vehicle for transforming the electoral laws in the country. So we have some actors here like the unions and citizens who are really important, but also really divided given the polarization in the country. So yeah, this is just sort of more recently what the shift is. So initially the UGTT was really trying to work with Saied, and only during the IMF negotiations did they become more critical of him because of the requirements that the IMF was going to place on Tunisia. But as we've seen, Saied hasn't really agreed to these IMF negotiations. So in some sense, he recognizes that this is a red line that will bring the UGTT out against him in stronger force, and he's been hesitant to take that on. So where do I want to end? Well, I want to end with sort of the bad news, which is that democratic backsliding in Tunisia is severe, and the current constellation of electoral laws and the political elite are being solidified in power through these elections. So last year, there were the first parliamentary elections under Kais Saied's system, extremely low number of candidates and extremely low turnout, but they still legitimized and created a new autocratic parliament now. So now Kais Saied can look and turn to a parliament when he's criticized and say, there are these other governing bodies that I'm working with. And in December, it's already December now, but in a few weeks, December 24th, the country is holding its first local elections in this new autocratic period. Again, Kais Saied radically transformed the electoral laws around those, and that's going to solidify this autocratic form of governance at the local level in the sense of we are going to elect through elections these actors, but they are going to exist within this autocratic system. So why has the situation perhaps gotten so bad? I haven't talked at all about the international community. What I want to say about the international community is that they are in a very weak position to do anything about the situation in Tunisia. You would think that the economic crisis would put the international community in a strong negotiating position to make demands of the Kais Saied regime because Tunisia is in dire need of economic support. But we know that the migration crisis across Africa and the Middle East has created a situation in which the international community, and particularly the EU, wants to form relationships with Middle Eastern or countries along the Mediterranean in North Africa or Turkey, for example, in order to externalize its border, in order to change the migration dynamics in Europe. And the sort of autocratization or the democratic backsliding in Europe, if you will, or the rise of right-wing parties in Europe is having a direct effect then on democratic backsliding in places like Tunisia. I'll end there.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamaklo. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.